The door closed behind her, and it did not open again. Clara Hale stood in the snow with her mother's trunk at her feet and her breath going white in front of her face, and she waited. Not for long, just long enough to be sure. That was the part she would remember years later. Not the cold, not the shame, but the waiting. The way she stood there with her hand half raised, certain the door would swing back open, certain her father would appear in it and say her name the way he used to, before the second wife, before the silence. The door stayed shut. Behind the window glass, a curtain moved. Just an inch. Just enough. She was 22 years old, and she had $11 sewn into the hem of her coat, and she had nowhere in the world to go. It had started 3 days earlier, over a saucer. Clara had been carrying the tea things in from the parlor, the way she did every afternoon, and the tray had caught the edge of the doorframe, and one saucer had gone off the side and struck the floorboards and broken clean in two. A blue saucer. Part of a set of 12 that Elsbeth Hale had brought into the house the day she married Clara's father, and that Elsbeth Hale spoke of the way other women spoke of children. The sound of it brought her stepmother out of the kitchen at a run. Clara was already on her knees with the pieces in her hands, already saying she was sorry, already saying she would pay for it out of the egg money, and Elsbeth stood over her and said, in a voice like a knife being drawn slowly, that Clara did things like this on purpose, that she had always done things like this on purpose, that she was a spiteful, jealous girl who could not stand to see her father happy, and that one day soon, she would break something that could not be paid for. And Amos Hale stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and watched. He did not say a word, not one. He looked at his daughter kneeling on the floor picking up the pieces of a saucer, and then he looked at his boots, and then he turned around and walked back out to the barn. That was the first thing Clara learned about her father, in that house, in that year. That he had made himself into a man who was always somewhere else. The second thing she learned at her mother's grave. She went out on Sunday, the way she always did, with the little hatchet to knock the ice off the stone and a handful of dried yarrow because nothing else grew in December. She knelt down and cleaned the letters with her thumb, Adia Al, beloved, and then she sat back on her heels and did what she had done every Sunday for 4 years. She talked. She told her mother about the winter and the price of feed and the mare's bad foot. And then, because it was Sunday and because the grave never answered back and because she had held it in for so long it had gone hard in her chest, she said the true thing. She said, "She doesn't love him, Mama." She said, "She loves this house. She loves everything you left." And she cried a little, the quiet kind, the kind you can do with your face still. And then she wiped her cheeks and stood up and walked home through the pasture, and she felt lighter than she had felt in months. She never saw the woman standing behind the cottonwood at the edge of the burying ground. She never saw her at all. By the time Clara got back to the house, the story had already been told, and it was not her story. Elsbeth was at the kitchen table with her hands over her face, and she was crying. Properly crying, loud enough to carry, loud enough to have been going on for exactly as long as it needed to. And Amos Hale was standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder and a look on his face that Clara had never seen before. The girl had accused her of theft, Elsbeth said, of scheming, of marrying a man for his land and waiting for him to die. The girl had said she would see her put out of this house before the year was over. The girl had said it right there in the graveyard, in front of her own mother's bones. That's not what I said. Clara's voice came out steady. She was proud of that later. I said she didn't love you. And her father looked at her. She really thought, in that half second, that he was going to laugh. That he was going to say, "Clara, girl, what a thing to fuss over." That he was going to take his hand off Elsbeth's shoulder. Instead, he said, "Apologize to her." Clara stood very still. "I'll tell her I'm sorry she's upset," she said. "I won't say I said a thing I never said. Apologize to her." Her father said again, "Or get out of my house." And there it was, not rage, not even conviction. Just a tired man choosing the easiest road in front of him, the road where the crying stopped and the house went quiet and he could go back out to the barn. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "No." She said it quietly. She said it the way you say a thing you have already paid for. Her father walked to the door and opened it, and the cold came in across the floor. That was it. That was the whole of it. No shouting, no breaking, a saucer and a sentence, and a man who would not be inconvenienced. Her trunk was on the porch within the hour. She had been standing in the snow for something close to 20 minutes when she heard the horse. It came up the road at a walk, unhurried, a big roan with steam coming off its neck, and the man on it did not slow down when he saw her and did not speed up either. He stopped a few feet away and sat there looking at the trunk and then at the closed door and then at her. Every soul in Colter's Bend knew Silas Rourke. Not one of them would have crossed the street to stand next to him. He was somewhere near 40 and built like something you'd have to move with a team. Dark coat, dark hat, 3 days of beard, and a face that gave you absolutely nothing. They said he'd run a doctor off his land at gunpoint. They said he'd let his own child die rather than pay what was asked. They said a lot of things in that town, and they said them freely because he never once came in to argue. He looked down at Clara Hale, standing in the snow, and he said, "That your trunk?" "Yes." "He put you out?" She didn't answer that. She didn't trust her voice for it. Rourke looked at the house for a while. At the window where the curtain had moved. Something happened in his jaw and then stopped happening. "It's 14 miles to the next town," he said. "It'll be dark in 2 hours, and it'll be 20 below by midnight. I've got a house with a stove in it and a room nobody's using." Clara's chin came up. "I don't have money for board, didn't ask for any." He shifted the reins. "You'd work, cooking, washing, the hens. There's plenty needs doing, and I don't do half of it." She thought about the 14 miles. She thought about $11 in her hem. "All right," she said, "one more thing." And now he looked straight at her, and it was the first time he had, and his eyes were not cruel, but there was something behind them that had been closed for a very long time. "There's a room at the end of the hall, last door. You don't go in it, you don't open it, you don't clean it, and you don't ask me about it. Not once, not ever." Clara waited for the rest. There wasn't any rest. "That's the condition," she said. "That's the condition." The wind came up off the pasture and moved the snow in long white ropes across the road, and somewhere behind her in the house she had been born in, a lamp was lit against the coming dark. "All right," Clara said. He got down and put her trunk up behind the saddle, and he did it easily, and he did not offer her his hand. The Rourke place sat in a fold of land 4 miles out, a low house with a deep porch and a barn that was better kept than the house was, and the first thing Clara noticed when she walked into it was that it was clean, not cared for. Clean. Swept and scrubbed and empty, the way a room is clean when a man has nothing to do in the evenings and cannot sit still. The second thing she noticed was the hallway. 4 doors, 3 of them standing open, the 4th was at the end, and it was shut, and there was a chair against the wall beside it. A plain kitchen chair, set there facing the door, the way you'd set a chair beside a sickbed. She did not ask. They did not talk those first days. He came in at dark and ate what she put in front of him, and said obliged and went out again to the barn where a lamp burned until all hours. She learned the well and the woodpile and where he kept the flour. She learned that he took his coffee black and never touched sugar, and that he could not sit with his back to a window, and that when he came through a doorway he ducked out of habit even where he didn't need to. She learned that he was not cruel. That was the strangest part. She had come prepared for cruelty, had braced for it the way you brace for cold water, and it never came. He was short. He was silent. Once, when she dropped a spoon, she flinched hard enough that she felt foolish about it, and he looked at her for a second too long, and then went back to his plate and said nothing at all. But he was not cruel. And every day, when the work was done, Clara went out and stood at the fence and looked at the road. That was the thing that nearly finished her. Not the expulsion. Not the cold. The road, because she was certain, genuinely, bone-deep certain, that it was a matter of days. Her father was slow, but he was not stupid. Sooner or later he would go into the barn and find the ledger in her hand. Sooner or later he would notice that no one had milked at 5 in the morning, or that his shirts had stopped mending themselves. Sooner or later Elsbeth would slip, would say one thing too many, and he would hear it, and he would understand, and he would come. So she watched the road. She watched it in the morning while the coffee boiled, and she watched it in the afternoon with her hands in the washwater. And she watched it at dusk with her shawl pulled up, until the light went and the ruts disappeared into blue. Nobody came. On the 4th day, a wagon came up the county road, and her whole chest went hot, and she started walking toward the fence before she could stop herself. And it was the Vance boy hauling posts, and he did not so much as look over. On the 6th day, she stopped running. On the 9th day, she stopped hoping, and she found out that hope going out of you is louder than hope coming in. She stood at that fence until her hands went numb, and she thought, he knows where I am. Everyone in the county knows where I am. He has known for 9 days, and he has not come, and that means he is not going to. And then, because there was nothing else to do with it, she went inside and made supper. Silas Rourke came in at dark, took one look at her face, and did not ask a single question. But that night, for the first time, he did not go back out to the barn. He sat by the stove and mended a bridle he had already mended, and he stayed there until she went to bed. The house began giving up its secrets a little at a time, and none of them on purpose. The first was a trunk in the loft, where she went hunting for extra blankets. Under the wool there was a dress, a child's dress, blue, with a torn hem somebody had begun to mend and never finished, the needle still in the cloth, the thread gone brittle with age. Clara put it back exactly as she had found it, and closed the lid, and sat on the floor of the loft for a while with her hand over her mouth. The second was in the barn, a wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, carved rough and then sanded smooth and then painted, and the paint worn off the back of it where a thumb had rubbed it 1,000 times. It was on a shelf above the workbench, and the whole shelf was thick with dust. The horse wasn't. And the third came at night, in the 2nd week, when she woke to a sound in the hall, and got up and looked out with the door open a crack. Silas Rourke was standing at the end of the hallway in his shirt sleeves, with a lamp in his hand, in front of the last door. Not doing anything. not reaching for the knob. Just standing there the way a man stands at a graveside, and he stood there so long that the lamp guttered, and then he turned and went back down the hall, and Clara pressed the door shut and got into bed, and lay there with her eyes open until it got light. The sound came on a windy night at the end of the second week. She was banking the stove and she heard it. A slow, uneven knocking from the end of the hall. Knock, 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 wood on wood. She stood up with the poker still in her hand and her heart going like a bird in a box, and she went down the hallway one step at a time, and she stopped in front of the last door. The knocking came again from inside. "Mr. Rourke," she said. And he was there, right behind her, close enough that she jumped, and his voice was low and flat, and it did not sound like a warning so much as a man reading out a sentence he'd read 100 times. "Window latch is broke," he said. "It's been broke 3 years. It bangs when the wind's out of the north. I only go to bed." Miss Hale. She went, and it would have been the end of it, except that as she turned at her own door, she saw him standing where she had been standing, with his hand flat against the wood, and he was not angry at all. He was listening. She went into town on a Saturday for coffee and lamp oil, and Colter's Bend taught her exactly what she was now. It started in Merle's store, with a woman she had known her whole life, pulling her little girl out of the aisle by the arm, as if Clara were something that came off on you. It went on at the counter, where Merle counted her change onto the wood instead of into her hand. It ended when Alma Dunphy said, not to her, about her, at a volume built for the room, that it was a wonder some girls could sleep at night out at that place with that man, and no ring on the hand. And her mother not 4 years in the ground. Clara stood at the counter, with her face burning and her supplies in her arms, and did not say a word, because there was nothing to say that would not be repeated wrong by supper. And then she saw her father. He was at the far end of the store with a sack of nails in his hand. He had been there the whole time. He had heard every word of it. He looked at her, and then he turned his back and studied the shelf. That was the moment. Not the door in the snow. This one. Something in Clara that had been holding on with its fingernails finally let go, and she felt it go, and she thought she might be sick right there on the floor of the store. The bell over the door rang. Silas Rourke had to duck under the frame, and the store went silent in the time it takes to draw one breath. He crossed to the counter, and he took the sack of coffee out of Clara's arms and put it under his own, and he looked at Alma Dunphy for a good 5 seconds. Then he said, to Merle, in a perfectly level voice, "She'll be in on Saturdays. She'll be paid up in cash, and she'll be treated like anybody's daughter." A pause. "Anybody who's got a problem with the arrangement is welcome to come out and say it to me on my own porch." Nobody came out to the porch, not that Saturday, not ever. He held the door for her, and they walked to the wagon, and he did not mention it again for the rest of his life. But Alma Dunphy got the last word in, the way her kind always does, and she pitched it just right so that it caught Clara square in the back on her way out. "You want to ask him what happened to his own girl, sweetheart. You ask him that." Clara did not ask him. She asked the widow Yancey instead, who took in washing and who had no interest in being liked by anybody. And that was how she learned about Nell Rourke, who was 6 years old, and who took a fever in the spring 3 years back, and who died on a Thursday. And about Doc Pruitt, who had ridden out to the Rourke place 2 days after, and who had been run off the property at gunpoint in front of 2 witnesses, and who had come back into town white-faced and told the story that had been the truth in Colter's Bend ever since. That Silas Rourke had haggled over the fee while his daughter burned, that he was a hard man and a mean one, and that if the child had had a different father she might be alive. "That's what he says," the widow Yancey said, wringing a sheet. "I'll tell you what I know. I know Silas Rourke rode into this town at 2 in the morning in April with that child wrapped in his coat, and I know he came out of Pruitt's house alone, and I know Pruitt didn't come out at all that night nor the next day." She snapped the sheet flat. "And I know Pruitt has been drunk every day since I've known him. Make of it what you want. Nobody else in this town ever did." She waited 2 more weeks before she said anything. She waited until a night when he was oiling a saddle at the kitchen table and the stove was making the only noise in the house. Then she said, "I heard about the doctor." The rag stopped moving, started again. "Everybody's heard about the doctor. I heard he told it wrong." Silence. A long one. "He was paid," Silas said at last, 2 weeks in advance on account for the whole winter. Everybody who kept an account with him did the same. He turned the stirrup over. "I rode in at 2 in the morning. I got him out of his bed. He said he'd hitch up and follow me out." The rag moved once more and then stopped. He didn't. Clara sat down slowly across from him. "He came out 2 days after," Silas said, "Sunday. Came out on a Sunday afternoon, with his bag and his hat in his hand, and she'd been gone since Thursday, and he stood in my yard and asked me was he needed. He looked up, and there was nothing in his face at all, which was somehow worse than if there had been. So I got my rifle and I told him to get off my land. And Ben Tate and the Vance boy were mending fence on the road and they saw the whole thing. And that's the story. That's all anybody's got, and it's true. Every word. But it isn't." Clara's voice cracked. "That isn't what happened. It's what they saw. Then why didn't you tell them?" She was on her feet without deciding to be. 3 years, Mr. Rourke. 3 years of that whole town looking at you like, why didn't you ever once tell them the truth? And Silas Rourke looked at her with an expression she would think about for the rest of her days, and he said, because the truth wasn't going to bring her back. The stove ticked. Clara stood there in that kitchen, and she thought about a woman crying at a table and a man choosing the easy road, and she thought about a Sunday in a graveyard, and she heard herself say, very quietly, everyone in this town knows who you are. Not one of them asked? Silas Rourke did not answer her. He didn't have one. But he sat there a long time after she went to bed, and in the morning, when she came out to build up the fire, it was already built up, and there was a chair pulled close to it, and her shawl was hanging over the back of it where it would be warm. That was the winter they stopped being a man and a girl who owed each other work, small things. He started saying her name, Clara, not Miss Hale. He came in earlier. He started eating at the table instead of standing at the stove. Once she caught him laughing, actually laughing, at something she'd said about the black rooster, and the sound of it seemed to surprise him more than it surprised her. He taught her to shoot, badly and patiently. She taught him that a house could have a smell in it, bread, mostly. And one evening she came in from the hens and found that he had set 2 plates on the table. 2. He was standing there looking at them, and when she came in, he took the second one and put it back in the cupboard without a word. Clara said nothing. She went to the cupboard and took it out again and set it down where it had been, and she sat down in front of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down and ate his supper. The blizzard came on the 8th of March, and it came up out of the north faster than anything Clara had ever seen. Silas had ridden out at noon after 20 head that had pushed through a drift and walked out through a down section of fence in the north pasture. A 2-hour job on a decent day. By 4 o'clock the sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind had come around and the snow was going sideways, and Clara stood on the porch with her hand over her eyes and could not see the barn. By 6 he was not back. She kept the stove going and a lamp in the window, and she was standing at that window with her arms wrapped around herself when she heard it. Bang, not the wind, not the loose shutter on the smokehouse. Bang. Bang from the end of the hall. She got a lamp and went down the hallway and stood in front of the last door, and she could hear it clearly now. The frame shuddering, the wind coming through with a high thin whistle, and under the door, running out across the floorboards and pooling against the wall, a thin bright line of melting snow. The window latch was broken. The window was open. The storm was inside that room. Mr. Rourke! She turned and shouted it down the hall at the empty kitchen, at the empty porch, at 4 miles of white nothing. Silas. Nothing. Of course nothing. Clara stood there with her hand on the knob and the promise she had made turning over in her chest, and she understood exactly what she was about to do, and exactly what it would cost her, and then she opened the door. The cold hit her like a hand. The window was wide open and swinging, the sash banging against the frame, and the snow had come in 3 feet across the floor in a long white drift. She saw the bed first, a small bed. A child's bed made up with a quilt, the pillow still dented. She saw a shelf with a doll on it, sitting up straight, and she saw the wall threckings. Dozens of them, pinned up in rows, paper gone yellow and soft, all in the same crooked hand. A horse, a house with too many windows, a big stick-figure man in a black hat holding the hand of a small stick-figure girl. A sun with a face on it. A dog nobody in that county had seen in 3 years, and the snow was blowing straight across them, and the paper at the near end of the row was already dark and pulpy and starting to come apart, and the ink was running down the wall in long gray tears. Clara put the lamp down and got to work. She took them down, carefully, so carefully, easing each pin out and stacking each sheet in order, and she carried them to the dry side of the room and laid them on the bed and wrapped them in her own shawl. Then she fought the window shut with both hands and her shoulder against the sash, and when it wouldn't hold, she broke her comb in half and wedged the tortoise shell down into the frame until it jammed. Then she got a blanket off the foot of the bed and packed it along the sill, and then she went for a rag and got down on her knees and started on the water before it could reach the far wall. She was still on her knees when the front door opened. He came down the hall with the snow still on his shoulders, and he stopped in the doorway of that room, and Clara looked up at him with her hands red and wet and a bundle of paper wrapped in her shawl on the bed behind her. She saw the whole thing happen in his face. She saw the man arrive and understand, and then she saw something older and bleeder come up from underneath and shove him out of the way. Get out, Silas, the window. Get out of this room. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the empty wall, at 50 small holes where 50 pins had been, at 3 years of a room he had kept exactly, precisely, unbearably as it was, and his voice came out of him raw and split open. You gave me your word. One thing. I asked you for one thing. I know. She was on her feet. She was crying and she did not bother to hide it. I know I did. Get your trunk. The words went into her like something with a point on it. You don't mean that. Get your trunk, Silas Rourke said. And get off my place. She walked out into it because there was nothing else to walk into. She left the trunk. She could not carry it, and anyway there was nothing in it she needed as much as she needed to be gone from that house, before she broke apart in front of him. She took her coat and her $11 and she went out to the county road and turned toward Colter's Bend, 14 miles, in the dark, in the tail end of a blizzard, because in town there was a hotel that sometimes wanted a girl for the kitchen, and past town there was a stage, and past the stage there was somewhere else, anywhere else, any place at all that was not a road she had already spent 9 days staring at. She got maybe 2 miles. Back in the house, Silas Rourke stood alone in his daughter's room with his hat still on. He saw the window, wedged shut with a broken comb. He saw the blanket packed along the sill. He saw the floor, half dried, and a rag lying where it had been dropped. And he saw, on the dry side of the bed, on the side away from the window, a bundle wrapped in a girl's shawl, and when he opened it with his hands shaking, there they were, every single one, dry in order, the horse and the house and the sun with a face on it, and the big man in the black hat holding the hand of the little girl, not one of them lost. Not one. He sat down on his daughter's bed with 50 sheets of yellow paper in his lap, and Silas Rourke, who had not made a sound in 3 years, made one. Then he got up and went out and saddled the roan in the dark. He came up on her a little past the creek crossing, and she heard the horse behind her, and she did not turn around and she did not stop walking. Clara. She kept walking. Clara. You told me to go. Her voice came out shredded. So I'm going. You don't have to watch me do it. He got down off the horse and came around in front of her and stood in the middle of the road so she'd have to walk into him or stop. She stopped. The snow had thinned to almost nothing, and the clouds were breaking up, and there was a hard bright moon on all that white, and she could see his face perfectly, and there was nothing shut about it anymore. You spent 9 days, he said, standing at my fence, looking down this road, waiting on a man who was never going to come. Clara's mouth trembled. I'm not going to let you do it twice, Silas said. Not on my account. And then he told her standing in the middle of a county road in the snow, because he had been carrying it for 3 years and it had to come out somewhere, and it turned out it was going to come out there. Her name was Nell. She was 6. She had his stubbornness and her mother's eyes, and her mother had died having her, and so for 6 years it had been the two of them, and he had honestly thought, that he had gotten away with it, that he'd been let off, that a man could be given something that good and just be allowed to keep it. She took a fever on the Monday. By Wednesday night, she didn't know him. He rode into town at 2 in the morning and got the doctor out of his bed, and the doctor said, hitch up, I'll be right behind you. And he rode home and he sat with her and he waited. He waited all night. He waited all the next day. He kept telling her. He told Clara this last, and it was the only part where his voice went. He kept telling her, he's coming, Nell, he's coming, just hold on, he's on the road right now. And she believed him, because she was 6, and because he had never once lied to her before. She died on Thursday at 4 in the afternoon, still waiting. So no, Silas said, I don't go in that room, because that room is the last place in this world where nothing's been moved. He looked away, down the empty road, and then back at her, and if a person gets in there and things start moving around, then it's over, then she's really gone. And I have not been able to. He stopped. Clara reached out and took hold of his sleeve with both hands. They were getting wet, she said. That's all. That's the only reason. The window was open and they were coming apart and I couldn't find you. And I would have let that whole house burn down before I let anything happen to them. I swear to you. I swear. I know. You don't, Clara. He put his hand over both of hers and it was the first time he had ever touched her. I found them. Dry, wrapped up in your shawl. His jaw worked. You put them on the far side of the bed, away from the window. She was crying too hard to say anything at all. Come home, Silas Rourke said, and she did. Amos Hale came up the road on the 14th of April. Clara was hanging wash when she saw the buggy, and she stood there with a wet sheet in her hands and watched it come the whole quarter mile, and she was astonished, genuinely astonished, at how little she felt. Her father got down. Elsbeth stayed in the buggy for a moment, arranging herself, and then came down too. Clara girl, her father said. Nobody had called her that in 4 years. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. In the family, things were said in temper. Your stepmother's willing to let it lie, and I want you to come home. Clara pinned the sheet up. Do you? She said. He shifted. He looked at the house and at the barn and at anything that wasn't her. There's some papers, he said. There it was. He got them out of his coat, and he spread the first one on the tailgate of the buggy, and he explained it the way a man explains a thing he has practiced in a mirror. The land was going to be sold. It was a good price. A better price than it would ever fetch again. It was all arranged with the bank in Sheridan, and there was only the one difficulty, which was a small legal matter, hardly worth the ride out here, honestly. Your mother's will, he said. She left the south half to you, comes to you at 23. He cleared his throat. That's this September. Clara stood absolutely still. I never knew that, she said. Well, her father folded the paper along its crease. It's a small thing, but the bank won't take the sale without your name on it. And that was the moment the whole of the last 4 years turned over and showed Clara its other side. Not a temper. Not a saucer. Not a sentence in a graveyard. Timing. She had been put out of that house in December, and she would have come of age in September, and somebody had known that. Somebody had always known that. Clara turned and looked at her stepmother. How did you know about the south half? Elsbeth's chin came up. Your father told me. No, he didn't. Clara took a step toward her. He just now told me, and I lived in that house. So how long have you known? Don't be absurd. I've never so much as seen that will. Then how? Clara said. Did you know it was the south half? Silence. It went on a beat too long. And into that silence, Elsbeth Hale said the words that finished her. Because she had been holding on to them for 4 years, and because she could not stand there in a yard and be beaten by a girl she had already thrown away. Because it says the south half and the water rights, you stupid little... She stopped, but not soon enough. Amos Hale turned his head very slowly and looked at his wife. The water rights, he said. Amos, that's the codicil. His voice had gone strange and flat. That's on the second page. That's the page I never... He stopped. He looked down at the paper in his hands and then at her, and Clara watched her father understand, 4 years too late, in a stranger's yard, what he had traded and what he had gotten for it. You said you'd never read it. Elsbeth Hale opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Amos Hale stood in that yard for a long moment. Then he turned to his daughter, and he put out his hand, and he said, Clara, come home. And Clara Hale looked at her father's hand. She thought about a saucer on a kitchen floor. She thought about a man in a doorway with his hat in his hand, choosing the barn. She thought about 9 days at a fence, and about a store in Colter's Bend where he had turned around and studied a shelf. She was not angry. That was the thing she noticed. She had used all of it up somewhere on a road in the snow in March, and there was simply none left. No, she said. Clara, you put me out of that house over one sentence, she said, and it was true. And you knew it was true, and it was just easier not to. She looked at him steadily. He let me in when I had nothing, and he never asked me for a thing but honesty. Her father's hand came down. I'll sign nothing today, Clara said. In September I'll come and see the land, and I'll decide what happens to it then. And I'll come in daylight, and I'll come in a wagon of my own. She stepped back. You can go now. They went. She did not watch the buggy out of sight. She turned around and walked back to the wash line, and Silas Rourke was standing on the porch where he had been standing the entire time. Close enough to be there, far enough not to be part of it, which was exactly, precisely right, and he stepped aside to let her come up the steps. They didn't talk about it. Not that afternoon. She made supper. He fixed the pump handle. The evening came down soft and green the way April evenings do, and the whole thing sat between them, getting heavier and heavier until it had to be picked up. He picked it up while he was carrying the cups to the sink. You could have gone, he said with his back to her. I know. You'd have had land coming to you, a house you were born in. He set the cups down. I've thought about it all afternoon, and I want to say this plain, because I'm no good at it and I'll only get worse the longer I stand here. He turned around. I don't want you staying because you've got nowhere else. I've had you here on a bargain, and I'd have kept to it and never said a word, but I'm done doing that. His hands opened and closed once. I want you to stay because when you walked into this house, it stopped being a place I was just waiting out. That's the whole of it. That's all I've got to say about it. Clara stood up from the table. He put his hand out, palm up, on the table between them, and he did not reach for her. He waited. He waited a long time, longer than he needed to, and Clara Hale put her hand in it. He turned to set the cups in the basin, and one of them went off the edge of the counter and hit the floor and broke. The sound cracked through that kitchen like a shot, and Clara froze. She could not help it. It was in her before she could stop it, her whole body gone rigid, her hands come up, her breath stopped somewhere in her throat, 22 years old and waiting, absolutely certain, for the voice that always came next. Silas Rourke looked at her. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not say her name. He got down on one knee and picked up the 2 pieces of the cup and dropped them in the ash bucket, and he stood back up and shrugged one shoulder. It's only crockery, he said. And Clara put her face in her hands and cried like she had not cried on the porch or in the snow or in the road. And Silas came around the table and stood there and let her, and did not tell her to stop. They opened the room at the end of the hall together on a morning in May, with the sun coming in on that side of the house. They took the drawings out of the shawl and pinned them back up. All of them, in order, the horse in the house with too many windows and the sun with a face on it. They opened the window on purpose, and let a whole spring morning come into a room that had held nothing but one Thursday afternoon for 3 years. Clara found the blue dress in the loft and finished the hem, and put it in the trunk at the foot of the bed where it belonged. And Silas told her about his daughter. Not the fever, not the doctor, her. That she had been afraid of chickens and nothing else on God's earth. That she had named the roan horse Horse and would not be argued with. That she sang badly, constantly, and always the same 4 bars. Clara laughed, out loud, in that room. And Silas Rourke stood in the doorway, and heard a sound in that house that he had not expected to hear again as long as he lived. When they went out, he stopped with his hand on the knob out of pure habit. 3 years of habit, and it went all the way down to the bone. Then he let it go. And they walked down the hall together, and behind them, for the first time since a Thursday in April 3 years gone, that door stayed open. Some doors close on us so that the right one can open. Clara lost a father and found a home. If this story touched you, leave a like and tell me in the comments. Would you have taken his hand? Subscribe so you never miss the next story. There's always another one waiting at the end of the road.